Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric. It's time to take one more walk through the video game trap house with me today, because there's a lot more details to talk about, a lot more fun to be had, and a lot more insanity to observe. Because Super Sega FPGA is the gift that keeps on giving, at least in comedy form. Alejandro, Spain's own Renaissance man himself, the master of ceremonies, is back with another interview, which I kind of helped set up, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. But we've gone through the entire Super Sega saga from start to finish when it was first announced, all the way through to this most current information. It doesn't seem like it's going to stop anytime soon, which for me is totally fine, because most people know now that this is definitely a risk not worth taking, and honestly I love making these videos, so I hope I get to keep doing them well into 2025. But as far as this is concerned, again, we basically dispelled the idea that this is anything other than a software emulation box at best. It is not a Dreamcast FPGA core, it is nothing more than what looks like the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey in video game console form. And of course we've seen Alejandro come into frame in the classic Lamborghini now, basically a meme at this point in time, which has always been confusing, because in one video he says he's in poverty, and then this video here today he says that it's owned by one of his companies. Seems to be that he owns more than one company. If the company's rich enough to own a Lamborghini, it's kind of hard to actually rectify those statements in your head that he's also in poverty and can't afford to produce these consoles. But of course we tried to poke holes in every single thing Alejandro's done. We'd have nothing but Swiss cheese, and of course the last time we saw him he was on camera torquing his pipe for some strange reason that we have absolutely no idea about. But another person, Ian Lee, contacted me and wanted to be put in touch with Alejandro because he wanted to interview him. So we chatted on Twitter, I got him some contact information, he contacted Alejandro in the background, and Alejandro wanted to go on camera for an interview. And it seems like Alejandro was in the mood to talk to somebody else because he granted that interview request. We actually got some interesting information out of this, including a look underneath what's on that CPU heatsink, so you can actually take a look at the chip underneath there, but it's going to be really hard to understand what's going on. And again, big thanks to Ian Lee for letting me use this footage. That was part of the entire package deal. He gets to interview Alejandro, I get to talk about the interview itself and show some of the footage on screen. And I will say, if that's not just the British Tim Robbins from Shawshank Redemption, I don't know who it is. Ian, you look exactly like him in all the best ways possible. But he was able to get Alejandro to take the heatsink off the Super Sega FPGA on camera so we can take a look what's underneath, and it is quite interesting. It doesn't answer every single question, it actually raises more than it answers, but at least we get to see what's under that heatsink. And again, you can see here that 2 of the 4 solder holes there, the vias, are not filled out because it seems like the heatsink doesn't actually line up with them. And why is this heatsink so absolutely massive for the chip underneath it? It is inexplicably so. It definitely could do a lot smaller of a heatsink, but honestly, if people are saying Alejandro is trying to hide what's underneath this thing at this point in time, at least he is willing to show it. And that is the thing, in these interviews and emails where I've communicated with him, he is more than willing to try to talk to people. The problem is those conversations go off the rails almost immediately. And about 2 months ago, the Super Sega FPGA team contacted me and they wanted to do an interview over Skype, but honestly when I set forth kind of the criteria that I would be looking for, including answers to technical questions to better understand what was going on with this PCB, they said they weren't able to answer anything technical, just wanted to talk about the pre-order process. And I did not feel like that was something that was worthwhile. But now we can see the chips underneath, and it seems like there's traces at least for the capacitors there, but everything else, including those surface mount chips that have legs coming off them, I don't see any trace pathing. Now it's possible that it is a multi-layer PCB and they're all hiding in there, but it's very interesting that those chips with the legs coming off, not the ball grid array FPGA chip, don't really have any traces going to them whatsoever outside of the ones for the capacitors. It is just an observation, do with it as you will, but again, underneath that heatsink doesn't show anything other than there is a chip mounted to that board. Could it be a full ball grid array soldered to the PCB? I guess it could. Could it be super glued down? That is likely as well. You really can't say anything about it whatsoever. It's not on camera long enough to really understand, and there really isn't any visible demarcation on that chip to be able to research what part that is. I'd be going on shape and shape alone. Well, I got some decent matches, nothing really 100% lined up, so as opposed to guessing at what's underneath there, I'll just tell you, it seems very strange to me, and you can kind of do with that as you will. But at least he was willing to take that heatsink off, and obviously it's Alejandro, so you know there's always going to be something funny going on here. Ian is asking him about the HDMI port and the fact that many people noticed that the solder was bridged and that port would basically be ineffectual. And he also asked about why there's two different power supplies going in, and Alejandro really doesn't have an answer to any of the technical questions, so much so stating that he's not the technical guy and really can't answer much of them. But there's never really anyone on camera other than Alejandro, so it begs the question, who else is involved in this thing? Who laid up this PCB? Because we're at least able to get into a program to route some things out, and they at least sent it off to get a prototype made. And then in the dual power supply question, he also talks about Cinemartin and shows off what I only assume is some sort of ProRes encoder here. Basically like an Atomos Ninja, you can just feed camera signals into a box and record them, but we never get a look at what's inside of it. It's never been anything that I've ever seen anyone review whatsoever. It could just be a rehoused item in a new plastic shell with their names on it. And again, he points out the fact that there's two different power supplies, and trust me, that is not something you usually see on any piece of cinema equipment. Usually you'd go D-tap out to something like an external recorder and monitor, one power lead, one video signal, either HDMI or SDI out, and you're off to the races. So again, this doesn't really help his case. We know that the Cinemartin 8K never shipped, but it did take a lot of money with it. So again, because he is a magician, he seems like the #1 vanishing act is products and people's cash, because there's nothing in this interview that's going to help you better understand the product, but there's a ton in this interview that's going to make you laugh a little bit. And I will leave a link to this video below. And again, big thanks to Ian for doing the interview. I was happy to get them in touch so we could get some more information. And we talk about those dual power supplies. There's always been that white USB cable going into the back of Super Sega, and apparently that supplementary 5-volt input, which would be, if it's actually true, a very bad engineering decision. It would mean that there was an issue with the power rails coming in. But I've always thought that maybe there's something hiding in that plastic case, like an HDMI wireless receiver and transmitter, because those are usually powered with USB 5-volt on the back of a television. But of course, we always have to guess at what Super Sega is doing, because we never have any idea. But I love that Alejandro just keeps running off camera to do different things, and Ian keeps thinking he's going to bring back something Super Sega related, and he usually shows up with either beer, more cigarettes, or potatoes that he's cooking in the kitchen during the interview. I mean it when I say it. Alejandro is a very interesting individual. I'm never quite sure why he's doing anything that he does, but I will say at this point in time, it is highly amusing to me. In some ways, I absolutely love Alejandro because he is a prototypical person that just basically breaks the mold of what you would expect. He did come back with potatoes, and that is absolutely hilarious. You can definitely tell he has been on television. You can tell he's a comedian and magician. He has this screen presence and timing that really makes him entertaining. Unfortunately, that entertainment values also come with the fact that he says somewhere between 100 and 300 people have pre-ordered the console, but he doesn't know how many. But he never really answers who does know the answers to these questions. Is it just Alejandro and nobody else behind this? Are there other people involved? Everything he says, everything he shows, everything he talks about produces 10 questions and maybe half of an answer. And I do love the fact that he disappeared just to grab those potatoes and cigarettes, and like 5 minutes later he disappears again to come back with beer, although he's drinking 0-0, and no judgments. If the man wants a beer, he wants a beer. He is the hardest working person in FPGA gaming development at this point in time, and that does gin up a thirst. But the thing is, underneath this heatsink, it is just weird again. The chew chips below the actual, what I would presume to be an FPGA chip, the ones with legs on them, 9 out of 10 times I see a chip like that, it has traces leading away from the legs. It could be internal as a multi-layer PCB, but that's not what I would expect to see there, and it isn't what I'm seeing. And honestly, we've gotten to the point now where we obviously know this is not an FPGA core running. It is some form of software emulation. Whether it's running on the PCB or not, we really don't know. My guess would be it isn't. It's running off screen or somehow being transmitted in. Obviously, a PCB does exist as something Alejandro can hold in his hand and show off on camera, but again, it's nothing that anyone will be able to say definitively how he's tricking people without having that PCB in the hand. That I've made multiple offers to buy one for $1,000 when it doesn't end up shipping, and that is still true. Once this project folds, if Super Sega FPGA is willing to ship it to me first and it arrives here in one piece, I will send them $1,000 cash so I can tear it down on camera. And that really is the thing. I want to get into this PCB. I want to start taking pieces off and being able to identify exactly how the sausage gets made. But Alejandro was willing willing to sit down with an interview for Ian, and I'm happy that I was able to put the two together and make that happen. A big thanks to Ian again for letting me use some of this footage, and honestly, it was a great interview where it had way more patience than I ever would possibly have in this situation. That's the current situation with Super Sega FPGA Trap House shenanigans. We've seen the chips under the heatsink, and they ask more questions than they provide answers. But if you have any questions of your own, leave them down below. Happy to chat with each and every one of you, and I know you guys love these videos, and trust me, they're not going anywhere until Super Sega does. But we're done, and I'll see you next time through the Video Game Trap House. Bye-bye.